Okay, so it's 7 o'clock. Let's get underway. This is the Sherborn Zoning Board of Appeals. It's March 31st, 7 p.m. This is a recorded Zoom meeting. The board members are me, Rick Novak, Jonathan Fitch, and Ron Stefik. It's a continued hearing on the Coolidge Crossing 40B project. Last hearing was 25th of February, I think. And since then, we've had some developments on the wetland side. I wanted to take a second, Brian and development team, other than wetlands, what do we have outstanding on this one, in your view?
Matt, you could, or Roy could step in. I think you had a couple of unanswered questions that we intended to address tonight from the prior hearing, which of course I wasn't involved on, but I believe outside of that, it's really just going to be the wetlands.
Okay, and just so I can get them in my notes, what are those outstanding items? Just in thumbnail, we'll deal with them after the wetlands. But
Mr. Chair, if I could address that.
Please.
There was a question relative to the height of, Michael Lesser had asked about the height of the light poles, and they are 12 feet. And per his recommendation, we have changed the light color to 3,000 as opposed to the previous 4,000. We've also adjusted the spread of the lights so they don't cross property lines or interfere with adjacencies. And we have a plan. I'm not sure if Todd sent it to you today, but we can send it to you tonight or tomorrow that reflects the changes that were made to accommodate the requests that were made.
Got it. So there's a new lighting plan coming.
If I may add to that, I just received it on my drive home tonight, so I can submit it tomorrow. We did have a meeting with Sean Killian at the DPW regarding the one light having some spillage over into the entryway. And not to speak for him, but we, during the call, had an agreement that was smart to do just for safety reasons with cars entering and exiting that location, but all other light spillage had been eliminated. So it's all, the lights stood on the site. And the one other the thing we went over with Sean was we had a stormwater connection in the on Coolidge Street in a public way. We have since talked with him and found a different route that we will not have to connect to the town's municipal stormwater system. So we'll keep that on site.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's take those up after we get to wetland, but those are great, good thumbnails, good placeholders. So from the development team standpoint, if we cover those issues and wetlands, you're feeling like you're close to the end of the process.
Yes, we do.
Okay, and we'll obviously hear from other people about their feelings, which may not be identical. Okay, on the topic of wetland, the applicant had submitted an NOI several weeks back, maybe in February, well after they'd filed this application. And in the intervening time, an unusual case came down in the Superior Court involving another 40B over in Weston. And in that case, where the NOI had been filed before any 40B filing had been made, the judge concluded that due to a funny interaction of the wetland statute and the wetland regulations, that the NOI was invalid because it was filed at a time that it could not have been filed. Town council had advised our Conservation Commission in the meantime, based on that case. And by the way, it's a case that a lot of people have a lot of different views on across the legal community. Many people think it's not well decided, others do. That's not for us to say. But town council had advised Conscom that the developer could withdraw if they wished, and they might well choose to do so, and that we should respect that if they did. And then I guess it was either today or a day or two ago, they did withdraw their NOI before the Conservation Commission. So there is no NOI pending before our Conservation Commission right now. That puts the Conservation Commission in a very awkward situation where they're trying to comment on the wetlands aspects of a project where there's nothing in front of them. And unfortunately, under the way the 40B rules work is all of their local discretion sits in the hands of this board for a 40B. And the developer requested, as, as is common practice, that all of those local non-state law requirements, all our local wetlands overrides, all our local wetlands bylaws be waived by this board, by the ZBA as part of the 40B process. So that's what we'll be hearing more about tonight, is what the Conservation Commission wishes to do about that. I've got some thoughts of my own. I bet they have their thoughts, and maybe the development team has thoughts, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. Mr. Vaughn, your counsel for the applicant. How did I do?
I think you did just fine. As you've stated, there's differences of opinion potentially on the Superior Court case. It's just a Superior Court case. However, the Conservation, Commission and Town Council weighed in, and I think we don't want to really confuse the issues between CONSCOM's role and your role as the ZBA in issuing a comprehensive permit, and just in an utmost conservative way, we thought the best way to handle it was to withdraw and then simply refile. Obviously, this board is handling the local bylaw issue, and we will be back in front of the Conservation Commission eventually. And I think I would just also note that although it may put the Conservation Commission in an awkward position, as you said, I would say, we did have a chance to put the entire filing in front of them. They're aware of what we're looking at. I was not involved, but there was a preliminary presentation to them. So they still, I think, have had ample opportunity to kind of review what we're doing. So it's not as if they're at any disadvantage for providing any comment to this board, that they have the ability to do so.
Mr. Chairman, if I may add one thing to that.
Michael, hold on for a moment. I think I agree with everything Mr. Vaughn said, except that I would say that the Conservation Commission is in a much better position than they'd be if no filing had been made. So,
right.
Who's here to speak for the Conservation Commission tonight? Michael, is that you?
No, I mean, I will speak as a Conservation Commissioner, but I don't think we were prepared that we were formally invited there, because I guess the commission has not met since this ruling and their withdrawal.
Yeah.
And so therefore, nothing has been, I'll just speak as one member, as that I'll just say that, right, this is a difficult situation for us to comment on the waivers when we don't have the work done for it. And I'll disagree with what Mr. Vaughn said about the fact that that we should have ample time and whatnot. We see the plans. We hadn't have time to do any review of the plans. We were going to have some technical assistance to review those plans, so that in order to make the case for certain issues, such as not waiving some of the bylaw issues, we haven't had time to even do that, or to collect the evidence to give that. So therefore, I would totally disagree with that picture of us having ample time and basis to do that. So we've had basically no time, since we haven't had time to really do any real technical work to justify. I mean, it's simple enough to say that there's reasons to say that we wouldn't want to, let's say, the no alteration zone or some of the bylaw stuff not waived, so that we have better jurisdictional control over to sort of mitigate any of the impacts that are there, since a large part of the project is in the buffer zone of the wetlands, albeit not, and there's still significant work in the no alteration zone, but that, so that make an argument that we shouldn't have that waived, so that we can make sure that we get a better protection of the wetlands in that area. But we don't have the basis to, I mean, a lot of the technical work done to say, here's why specifically. And so, and we're meeting tomorrow night to discuss what we do about whether we just have to send some sort of general letter to you that's been drafted that would hopefully come out of tomorrow night's meeting about that. But again, it won't be as substantive as it would be if we were actually had the hearing going and we had the supporting information.
Okay, good. That's helpful context. Thank you.
And I'll also bring up the issue of stormwater, that for us, the stormwater issue is important because so much of the stormwater is in the buffer zone. And it was still the issue from before that, whereas you've had review of the stormwater, it doesn't seem to have factored in the idea of what can be done to the stormwater design so that it would be lessening the impact in the buffer zone that it has there. Last time it was claimed that it's just little tweaks of the system, but that's a little hard for us to judge without basically looking at it more carefully, that there is a different kind of review. And that's somewhat of a structural issue of how this goes on with the ZBA peer review. And when there's a lot of stormwater work in a jurisdictional area for the wetlands, that you have a stormwater review that doesn't fully factor in all of the wetland issues, and that we're trying to like to avoid in the future sort of a duplication of sort of review. That's one that's a little bit more comprehensive, but that's another issue.
Mr. Chair, if I could comment.
Please.
The only reason we withdrew was brought to our attention by the chair of the Concom on the issue, and the recommendation, at least the interpretation we got from the chair of the Concom and from town council, it would be wise for us to withdraw given that decision. So that's the only reason that happened. And if the chair would not mind, I'd be interested in Stephen Boulet's comments relative to Mr. Lesser's comments about the stormwater.
I was going to ask that as well, and I thank you. And you know, let's go there next because that sort of is on the table. Steve, what was your no, Michael? Well, you have to wait a second.
Before you move to stormwater.
No, Michael, please. Steve, can you respond on the stormwater side? I thought maybe I misunderstood that from a peer review standpoint, you were okay with the stormwater.
Correct. And from our standpoint, the stormwater, met the standards, for mitigation. But yes, Mr. Lesser is correct. It wasn't reviewed in context of the Wetlands Protection Act.
Okay.
So from a technical standpoint, the stormwater system is adequate, but still it hasn't been reviewed from the Concom standpoint.
Got it. And as peer reviewer, you're not saying it passes muster for under wetlands or not. You just didn't review it for those purposes.
Correct.
Fair enough. Thank you. I'm sorry. Who was trying to speak?
Well, I believe Mr. Lesser was first, and then I wanted to make a comment.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Lesser.
All I wanted to say is to Roy's comment that there's always a timing issue. Even if you hadn't withdrawn the application, it'd still be the difference between, it would still have taken us time to be able to fully review the proposal, so that even in terms of getting the kind of peer review or consultant support that we need for a project of this size. So that so it's not just purely a function of the fact that the application, because of the Supreme Court, or the court issue that it was withdrawn, we would have had timing issues in being able to reply anyway, given when it was submitted and when it took us to basically select our peer reviewer consultant, and then I guess it's really a consultant, and then be able to provide some substantive information.
Mr. Chair, you're on.
I'm muted. It's very hard for you to hear me now, wasn't it, Matt? You're next, please. Go ahead.
Just one quick comment is that Mr. Lesser had indicated that the stormwater under this board's peer review had not really been looked at through a wetland lens, wetlands buffer zone for impacts, et cetera. I would just point out that the stormwater standards that the project was reviewed under for this board by Tetra Tech, those standards, those stormwater standards are promulgated under the wetland protection regulations. So I would disagree with that and say that the purpose of those standards is to protect wetlands and buffer zones, and we meet those standards. So I would disagree that the stormwater review that's been done has not factored in any concerns or issues with wetlands or buffer zones. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Michael, hold on. Anyone else on the subject of wetlands and wetlands procedures and timing? Dennis.
Mr. Chairman, Dennis Murphy from Hill Law. You're discussing my case from Weston. I represent the Lisa Revers, the plaintiff in that matter, and the other abutters as I do in this matter. And I just wanted to comment quickly that that case has had ramifications in a half dozen other 40Bs. And the position taken here in Sherborn is the majority position. That is, most NOIs that were pending have been or are going to be withdrawn. You know, the traditional way of permitting 40Bs near wetlands is to come in with an assumption that your local wetlands bylaw will be summarily cast aside. And I think what this decision, well, not this assumption of the board, but the assumption of the design engineer is that how they design stormwater infrastructure, the placement of buildings, and so on and so forth, is to comply with state standards and not necessarily to look at how and whether they comply with local standards. And I think the practical effect of this decision is that it puts the onus on the applicant to actually justify whatever waivers they're requesting, because you will have the power to grant the waivers. And ordinarily, they only give the zoning board very preliminary plans and say, please just give us our blanket waiver or plan waiver, because we're going to have to go to Concom for an NOI anyway. In this situation, I think the better practice will be that this board will have to hear from the applicant why it needs particular waivers from, say, you know, the no disturbance zone, or the, you know, very particular waivers under the local regs and regulation, rules and regulations. Thank you.
Okay, and we appreciate all that, Mr. Murphy. It's helpful color to understand your involvement in the case. I think there are definitely a lot of permitting lawyers, including many who are my partners, who think it puts conservation commissions in a very difficult position of flying completely blind. But the case is what it is, and people will do what they will do, and we have the facts we have. No one is going to ask this applicant to refile this NOI, or certainly I will not, from this board, criticize them for withdrawing it, because in the face of that case, it makes some sense. Other thoughts and views on the NOI withdrawal, and where we should go from there going forward? Michael.
I partially was from before wanted to react to Matt's comment that I think there is, and sort of I think what Steve had sort of acknowledged is that there is this interplay of, yes, you can meet the DEP stormwater standards, but the interplay between whether there's alternative designs that can mitigate when you have so much of the stormwater system in the buffer zone, and some of it in the no alteration zone, that there's a different kind of review, there's a different level or different changes that could be asked about to discuss, as I brought up before, we had brought up before, and other things of just whether there should, the whole issue of whether it's just a tweak to change the parking lot sizes, or whether permeable or whatever you want to call it, permeable or porous asphalt would make a significant difference in the amount of area that's in the buffer zone and what that means for wetland impacts. So that there is, I think, another level that can come about for a project that could still meet the standards in other ways, but when it's that much in the wetland jurisdictional areas, it's not as clear cut to do it the way it was done now. And I think this new case, as to what Dennis was saying, is that does put us in a tricky position of whether it forces a different process in the future of how much more wetland review or stuff has to be done by a peer review for the ZBA in the absence of an NOI. Yeah, I could see the pluses and minuses of this case, but it does, from my point of view, seem to put it in a difficult position. And I'm not quite sure what you can do in the sense of the fact that what it means for doing waivers. I mean, maybe we'll have more to say to you after tomorrow night's meeting at the Conservation Commission. We'll draft you something about that issue, but I can't say much more at the moment now as just one member about
Right.
how you can move.
So looking at the other lawyers, Dennis and Brian, I think we would all agree that regardless of whether there's an NOI on the table or not, the Conservation Commission or even any citizen can weigh in with our board as to whether or not it's wise to grant these waivers. And you know, and for whatever reason, and then it's the board's job to decide whether or not to grant them, and whether or not, if we wish to grant them, whether that's something that outweighs the need for local housing. So where I'm inclined to encourage this group is to have our Conservation Commission and any other interested party weigh into the board on whether or not those waivers should be granted, because they won't be able to weigh in on an NOI. There isn't any NOI on the table. And yet they can look at the NOI that used to be filed and get some hints as to where things might go. That's sort of the procedural approach I'm inclined to take. Mr. Vaughn, Mr. Murphy, how do you feel about that?
I'm in agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add that, you know, it's to some extent on this issue, I think your opinion matters most. You're the board that's actually waiving anything under the local bylaw. As far as, you know, having a stab at the apple on the actual NOI, you know, the result of Mr. Murphy's case isn't that there isn't a chance to review it. It's just that the chance to review it and comment on it and to have a separate consultant on it is with a separate permit to be issued later. So we for sure will be back in front of the Conservation Commission and hearing their input. It's just a function of the 40B process that you know, although it's wetlands issues under the local bylaw, it's the zoning board who is the deciding party, and I'm not about to tell this tribunal what you should or should not be considering. That's
Right.
the function of the chairman and the ZBA, of course.
Right, and board members, Mr. Vaughn makes an excellent point. Regardless of what we hear from Conscom or anybody else, we're stuck with this decision. We're simply soliciting subject matter expertise from a board or from anybody in the public who's willing to offer it, but it's still our call.
That's right. I agree with that statement. Any interested parties should submit comments on the waivers that are requested from us, and they will be helpful, I'm sure, to our consideration.
Right. So Michael, I'd ask you to go back to your board, please, and do weigh in with whatever you think is wise and fair to say. Please do tell them, and I think the other lawyers would agree with me on this, that when they review the NOI later, they're only going to have the state standard to look to. All of this board, the ZBA, will have already swept aside or granted or waived or conditioned or whatever, but there won't be any remaining local issues for the Conscom to consider.
Oh, can I ask a clarification?
Sure.
I guess since we don't do this very often, if for example, you did not grant a waiver, does
Right.
that mean that of something, let's say some part of our bylaw was not, that you didn't grant them a waiver for that, and that some of it held, that, are you saying that still we would not be able to use that in our NOI? It would only come up in the way you would condition the project?
I believe that's correct. I believe our rule for a 40B, I think our ruling is the only ruling. So you will need to think for 40B purposes as if all of the local rules and regulations were off the table and you were solely administering the state statute and state regulations.
Oh, I thought that if you didn't grant a waiver, that then it would be part of the NOI process, but you're
Well,
telling me otherwise.
Right. You can certainly consult with town council and he
Yeah.
may have a different view, but I think your board ought to plan on having absolutely no local overlay when they consider this NOI. And therefore, we'd like you to speak now and not assume you're going to have any of those rights.
Yeah, no, it's just hard to figure out how to say the right conditions that are based on a bylaw that if you were willing to consider something that would come under the bylaw, then we would have to write the condition ahead of time. And then when we actually write our conditions, they would only be under the state. And the only ones that is what you're saying, which is a little different than I understood it to be, but obviously something we have to sort out.
No,
Or whether just take it at what you've just said, and we'd have to put that forth now, and it's not, and that's it.
You know, you make an excellent point, and that's a really good example, Michael. If there's a particular condition that you think is essential, you should put it on the table with us now, because it'll either get voted up or it'll get voted down. If it gets voted up, it's in our decision and binding on them. If it gets voted down, your board will have no chance at it.
Wow. So it does put us.
It doesn't make me happy to tell you that. It's just the way.
Oh,
the
no.
law's written.
I mean, it's just it's a reality of this thing here where, I mean, at least we've seen an NOI to some extent, but right, for cases where you don't even see that at all, then right, it makes it a much more difficult process, or we just have to combine much more with the peer review. We didn't press the peer review for the ZBA on the wetland stuff because I had a different, basically in the future, we would have pressed the peer review on the wetland side much earlier in the process so that we wouldn't be where we are now, or whether, depending on your timing, whether now we'll have to discuss it tomorrow, whether we even have the option to say, here are some of our biggest concerns. Can you get the peer reviewer to comment on these to help us with any possible conditions if that might be up? Will there be time for that option? Now that with all of this, with this new understanding, so to speak.
Well, that raises the next question in my mind, which is, I'm sure a lot of people did not come to tonight's hearing expecting the wetlands issues to be foreclosed, including me. And the question is, what's a fair and rational amount of time to allow those to be vetted, given the new landscape in which we find ourselves? And Michael, you might have a time frame in mind, and Mr. Vaughn might have a time frame in mind, and I bet those two time frames are not the same. So that's one of our jobs tonight, is to come up with what's a fair turnaround time for the CONSCOM and other interested parties to weigh in with this board on what waivers we should and should not grant.
And that would, and that would depend on, now it's a different view of to what extent the peer reviewers scope of work that had some wetland review. To what extent do we have access to that, and what would be their turnaround time, let's say, is related to that. If we, to the extent that we come up with some issues tomorrow and then try to work with the ZBA peer reviewer to see if there's something that that could be done within a reasonable time frame, and whether we have access to that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could comment.
Please.
I agree. I think if the CONCOM could get a detailed letter to the ZBA outlining any issues, comments, or items they would like reviewed, we'd be more than willing, if it's reasonable, to have Tetra Tech review those and get back to the ZBA with comments.
That's a gracious offer, and we appreciate it. We think it's constructive, or certainly I do. I don't want to speak for the other board members. Yes. Is it Ms. Wiedner?
Yes, thank you. Am my mic on? So at the last CONCOM meeting, there was a fair amount of work done to choose a consultant who was well-versed in the Wetlands Act, as I understood it. whereas Tetra Tech, as I think it's come out, has most reviewed on more of an engineering side, if that's a fair statement. And I'm wondering if, as part of the ZBA peer review, if you could send these issues to the consultant that the Concom had researched that might be appropriate to deal with more on the wetland reg side rather than Tetra Tech.
Mr. Chair, if I could please
Wait,
comment.
hold on. That's certainly one option, and we're trying to come up with some fixes. Mr. McDowell certainly has something to say, so go ahead, sir, please.
As you well know, that we've spent significant money having Tetra Tech do a lot of the peer review work on this project already. They're extremely knowledgeable about it, and they're a very large firm that have a lot of depth in the areas of concern of the Concom. And we prefer to stick with a firm that's already well into it rather than going to another firm, especially since we're in front of the ZBA. Now, if the Concom wants to do something in the future, when we do a new filing with them, that would be up to them at that time.
Right, although I think you'd agree with me, at that time, they'll be handcuffed to the state regulations only, so.
Well,
They may
again,
have to-
I only
right.
say staying with Tetra Tech because they're well into it, and I think it would be a much more efficient process to have them do it.
Okay, so let me, hearing all this, let me propose to the group and to my fellow board members to think about, maybe we should set the next hearing at a fairly short date, to give the Conservation Commission a chance to send us their essentially ask letter. Here's what we would like. Michael, we would like the Conservation Commission, if they have a reason to not use Tetra Tech, to spell it out in the letter. Nobody's trying to disrespect. There are a lot of good professionals out there in the world. Tetra Tech has wonderful people. There are other wonderful people. There's a concrete reason why you really prefer another. We're open to looking at that, although I have to say, in favor of the developer, that the competent peer reviewer who's on the table is sort of a default setting for most boards. And so I think that's how we might lean. I'll have to see how the other board members, but I'd propose for discussion, I'd like to hear what the board members think about this, that we have maybe a 1 week or 2 week to the next hearing, just to give this Conscom process a chance to flush through. If we see their letter, it may be that the developer will look at it and say, wow, that's great, we'd love to do that. Or they may say, forget it, we've got to go some other direction. How do people feel about that, board members? I want to hear from the board members first, please, and everybody else.
Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
Thank you, Ron. Well, I agree with the proposal that we schedule a meeting, as I understood you, Rick, for April 7th or thereabouts, to hear back from Conservation Commission and the applicant on these issues, and give everybody a chance to basically process all of this information and think how they're going to provide meaningful impact in the making of our decision on the waivers.
Ron?
I agree with that. It just seems like a week is a pretty short period of time. And I'd wondered if maybe 2 weeks is more reasonable.
Well, if we went out to the 12th, that's a little less than 2 weeks. That's a Monday. But it might give the Conscom 2 Thursdays on which to meet. I'm sympathetic to your idea, Ron. I'm just trying to come up with but also
Well, that
trying
seems reasonable to me then. Yeah.
Jonathan?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
All right, so now that's sort of the working assumption on the table. Everybody else can throw rocks at it. Michael, I'd like to give other people a chance to go first, though.
Mr. Chairman, I just mentioned, I believe I can check with Gino, but I believe there was some amount of wetlands review or some amount of in the Tetra Tech proposal from the original proposal that was agreed to.
That's correct.
And go ahead, Steve. From
We
Tetra
had
Tech.
sorry, Mr. Chairman. In our initial proposal, we had included wetlands, but we were asked to take it off as part of what was actually agreed to. But I'd just like to add that we are, we're more than capable of reviewing the wetlands. We have wetland scientists on our staff. We do this all the time. So there's really no issue with us continuing with the peer review.
Okay, and if the CONSCOM is willing, if the applicant and Tetra Tech can be part of this discussion with them between now and the next ZBA hearing, it would be great if everybody could be on the same page and have a unified proposal, but life doesn't always work that way, and we'll take whatever we get. Other commentary from the public? Other than Michael, and it looks like you're up. Please go ahead, sir.
Oh, I guess I'll just say, we'll see what comes out of tomorrow night's meeting. This is right. We'll do our best. It's sort of, it's pushing to do a very abbreviated, quick effort that will not be as studied as one would want to do on a project like this, but I understand, I see your constraints, and we will essentially get to do a more detailed work at the when the NOI is filed. Obviously, it might be under different, maybe just under the state things there, but I guess I don't know what I could speak for the fact that it's basically pushing a very abbreviated process on the Conservation Commission, but I don't see that it would be, I guess, I don't know what other people would feel about, what the commission as a whole would feel about this kind of very abbreviated process. And so we'll see how that goes. I don't want to be able to speak for.
Just make sure we're not talking past each other. All we're asking for in this little under 2-week period is your proposal for how to proceed. If CONSCOM and the applicant and Tetra Tech can all come together on a timeline that says, and another week after that we can have, or another 2 weeks after that we can have X, nobody agrees that's a good idea. I certainly, speaking for myself, would receive that well. But if in 2 weeks or less it comes back that you say, well, we can't possibly do this in less than 8 weeks, and the developer says, well, we think that's not appropriate, then we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. We're just trying to allow an opportunity for a time for people to sort of reset and come together is the proposal.
All right.
Mr. Chair.
Hold on. I think Daryl Beardsley was up next. Daryl?
Okay, I do have a few comments, but the one for right now would be that the Board of Health's next meeting is April 7th. And if you wanted to get comments from us based on what might come out of the discussion, brief discussion I'd like to have tonight, that would not be a good time for us. We could not get you something by then.
So that's another reason to, right, that's another reason to push it into that next week, the week of the 12th through the 16th.
Okay.
All right, great, thank you. I think, Roy, I think you were next, sir.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I think that's a very reasonable time frame. 2 more weeks. We're going to be speaking with the CONCOM as well tomorrow evening. And the CONCOM, by the way, has had these plans since November. And of course, as someone mentioned, we did an NOI filing. So they've had a lot of time to look at these plans. And I would hope over the next 2 weeks, they could get the comments to your board and to ourselves as well, so we can all consider what they're looking at.
Okay.
Okay.
So, board members, we're talking about the week of the 12th through the 15th. What nights could work? We can't do the 15th. We have another engagement.
Right. I have no conflicts for the 12th, 13th, or 14th. I'm open there.
Jonathan, the night of the 14th?
14th is fine.
Ron?
Yeah, good.
Okay. There's no formal motion on the table. I'm still just trying to feel around for consensus. Other objections to the 14th for a response from the CONSCOM, hopefully informed by their discussions with Tetra Tech and the applicant on the way ahead on gathering opinions and recommendations on the waivers. All right. In that case, without closing the hearing, because we may have other things to talk about tonight, I'm going to suggest that I'm going to move that we continue this hearing whenever it ends to the night of Wednesday, April 14, 7 p.m. by Zoom. That's my motion.
Second,
Lively discussion. All right, we have to do this by roll call vote. Novak votes aye.
Stefik, aye.
Fitch, aye.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I think that's a fair to all process. I appreciate everyone's patience as we work through something that I'm sure caught everybody a little bit by surprise. All right, other non-wetlands issues that we should discuss tonight, if any. On the light poles, it sounds like there's a new plan coming in from the developer side. Todd, yes.
Yes, I'll send that to the town in the morning tomorrow.
Great. And maybe with it, you could include a little cover note about whatever you and DPW have agreed on that light spillage over the entryway, and then that'll be in our records too.
Can I comment on that particular part?
Michael, go ahead.
You made reference to, I guess Roy and others made reference to the comments I had made back in February. From what you did say about the new light plan, it addressed only some of the comments in my memo. So I'm wondering about whether you want to deal with it now, or you just see, because you talked about changing the color to 3000, but in terms of the specs for the LED efficiency and wattage and the capability of being dimmable in dark skies and other kind of things, and the warranty, there was basically a list of things in that memo, and whether each of those are going to be addressed, or that's and whether the peer review is going to compare that to the new plan, or whether you want to bring it up now, because you only mentioned essentially one thing, and pole height actually wasn't the question I brought up. Somebody else had brought up the pole height last time.
Mr. Chair, if we could receive that memo again, we'll respond to it tomorrow.
We have it.
Right, right. Where I was going to go on this is what I'd like to see is the new plan, whatever responses you wish to make to the prior memo, and then to the extent, Michael, you feel that the new plan, when you look at it, doesn't react to your memo, you can certainly supplement it and say, wait, I think they skipped X and Y and Z.
Fine.
We'll certainly take a look at that. Okay. Let's
Mr.
see.
Chairman, may I bring up something regarding the water?
Yes, please.
So at our last meeting, we'd been asked about the likelihood of neighbors being able to connect to the Framingham water. So I had a nice conversation with the Pulte representative today, who I believe this week is having a meeting with the Framingham DPW. And if all goes well as hoped, that agreement should be forthcoming, which would then have to go to the mayor for her to sign off on. What is being considered at the moment is that I believe the Meadowbrook neighborhood would be within the water district that would be created. And if there was down in the future an issue with a well, or it became not viable, or something came up, they would have, I believe, there will be the amount allotted, the water allotted for that home or those homes, and they would be able to connect in the future.
That sounds like welcome news to me, but let's see what the neighbors say. Ms. Widner.
Whittemire.
Whittemire, sorry. The name on the screen is John Thompson, so it's harder for me.
So you're doing good. Who would pay for that? And is the water, it has to be water and sewer, because you can't have something coming in and nothing going out, as I understand that basic hydrology. Will those pipelines be part of the initial project so that then it's an option when things go bad to just simply say we want to hook in? That would be my proposal, that this be, if this project goes forward, and you're permitted to, move between watersheds and all of that, that this be, the pipes be laid now.
I would have to look further into that. Roy, do you know more than I?
No, I'm not sure it goes all the way up the street. I think it's get the availability for connection and probably extension of the pipe. But I don't think the extension of the pipe is included.
So who would pay for it and when would it happen? I mean, my suggestion is you just do it now while you're.
Well, the homeowners would pay for it.
We would have to have our wells ruined by this project and have to pay for pipe coming down from Coolidge down all the way down the street.
No, it wouldn't be from Coolidge. It would be from where the Pulte development is. So it would not.
There's no reason it would be this project if there was an issue with something from Framingham or something like that. It's not necessarily. I wouldn't put the blame on this project.
Right. The wells ruined by this project could be seen as being argumentative. It might be a contributing factor, but.
So it would be by the Pulte combined projects?
Well, actually, I'm not an engineer, but I think by far the most likely threat to your wells is what's coming down from General Chemical. That doesn't make it any easier, but it does make it less the fault of the Pultes or these gentlemen.
So what would the estimated cost be per house that you're suggesting that each neighbor pay for these problems?
Well, this is more of a solution if, say, something from General Chemical does, in the unlikely event, cause an issue with the wells. It gives the neighbors an option that otherwise would not exist.
My question was the cost.
No, I
appreciate that we're giving it's an interesting twist to the issue, that to say it's a General Chemical problem, and I appreciate that. I would think it's probably a aggregation of issues, but I'm just interested in what the cost per house would be, if anybody has any.
Mr. Chair.
Mark?
Roy, go ahead. Do you have the answer to that?
Well, I don't have the answer, but I will say this, if you're doing one house, it's a significant cost. If you're doing all the homes in the street at the same time, the cost goes down dramatically because you're running pipe for many homes as opposed to one. So it's impossible to give you a straight answer without knowing how many homes would be done at the same time.
Well, assume if the wells are bad, there's 12 houses, assume that it would be each house, I guess.
Sitting here, I really couldn't give you an answer because one would have to look at a plan and see what the distance is from where Pulte brings the pipe to, and we can have someone take a look at that, maybe guess estimate, but it's hard to give you I couldn't give you an answer sitting here.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, if I could, one more thing. I'm not so sure if you have public water, why you still couldn't use a septic system.
Right. There are a lot of towns that do that. I mean, from the standpoint of the hydrology within that 1 acre or whatever size the lot is, it does seem a little odd because the water's coming in from Quabbin and then going down into the septic system, but it's done all over the state. Okay. Good question, good answers. Thank you. Very responsive. Other issues we should be talking about tonight other than the wetlands. Carol Beardsley, are you wearing your citizen hat or your Board of Health hat?
I'm going to wear a Board of Health hat.
Okay.
Okay. So on the good news front, I had the agent take a look at the report that I believe was done by Mr. Leidner, soil evaluation of the property. And so I was concerned because the Board of Health does have jurisdiction over stormwater at the town level. And some of those concerns relate to how the stormwater is managed and net change in either flow onto or off of the site as a result, how groundwater is being recharged effectively or not, whether it's getting filtered and cleansed before it goes into the ground, and how that affects drinking water. Also, if, for example, if there was significantly more flow off-site or a change, you might have flooding of neighbors' septic fields, that kind of thing that causes all sorts of problems. Hence our interest in stormwater, which we ordinarily defer on many other projects over to the studies that Concom does pursuant to that. So the good news is, though, took a look at the report, and even though the what's more typical is when soil evaluators are at a site that it's observed by the Board of Health agent. However, he went through the report, found that yes, models were identified, which is a really great indicator of historic high groundwater, because that was part of the concern that we had. Is it kept mentioning seasonal high. That's not sufficient, especially when it was done following a drought period. So the models are a good indicator, roughly anywhere from 18 to, or 1.5 feet to 3 feet depth is what was found. Typically, the agent also was able to check that other observations in that general area, that these were consistent with the ones that we've seen on other properties. So we've cross-compared. So the concern remains, though, and this again is for long-term benefit, I guess, to the drinkers of groundwater in town. I don't think it's something insurmountable. Certainly, low-impact development techniques have been really successful in addressing this kind of thing. But with water, the groundwater level potentially being that high, if you're going to be putting in retention ponds or swales and going down into the earth to capture the water, discharge it, it's not going to address a few things. It may not infiltrate rapidly enough, and then may overflow those provisions. Also, if any bacteria is captured in the runoff, and there's a dynamic where if bacteria and viruses stay wet and don't have a drying out period in the soil, and you've got essentially the stormwater sitting in groundwater to begin with, then that bacteria and viruses do not die off, and then will just live as they travel through the groundwater. And there are plenty of studies, Cape Cod is the poster child for these kinds of things that document that dynamic. So I hope that there are some investigations into how can we ensure that the groundwater the stormwater catchment is not actually sitting in groundwater to begin with. So that, I'm just going to say, is going to be an important thing to look at, can be addressed. I don't know the details of the property. So that is one.
Mr.
Any
Chairman,
questions from the folks on that? Just what I mean by any
Daryl,
of that?
I'm sorry, from a procedural standpoint, it's important to know that your board is going to be in exactly the same position as Conscom, which is speak now or forever hold your peace.
Yes.
So if you have particular conditions you think we should put in based on the way this is designed, please write them down and send them to us, because we're charged with granting the waivers or not. They've asked that all those requirements of yours be waived. Please go ahead. Yes.
Can I respond?
I would be interested
hold on.
just to hear if this has already been addressed, and then we won't need to specify anything.
All right, Matt, here's your opening.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the feedback and the comments. In terms of the concern about water kind of sitting there, maybe stagnating, That's a good comment, particularly based on the depths that we found to historic groundwater not being very deep. As discussed at the last meeting, we are picking this site up, if you will, in order to get the required separation to the historic high groundwater, which is one of the requirements under the DEP stormwater standards. That was peer reviewed as well, but we have proposed to maintain 4 feet of separation between the bottom of all of the infiltration systems, the lowest elevation in them, and the historic high groundwater level. There was one comment from Tetra Tech. There was one small place where we interpreted the data slightly differently, but there's a solution there. We will be picking that basin up just slightly, one corner of the basin, to get the 4 feet of separation based on Tetra Tech's interpretation. So all the basins, all the infiltration systems, underground and the surface basins, will have that 4 feet. And the intent there is that even at its high, when groundwater is at its highest, you still have an adequate zone of permeable soil above the groundwater for the water from the basin to go into. And furthermore, the stormwater report that this board has before them and that Tetra Tech reviewed does have calculations showing the drawdown time. So basically the time that the basin takes to drain dry. Does have that in there, and as required, these will meet this. There's a 72-hour maximum time or time limit on drawdown, and these basins will meet that. So I appreciate the question. I believe it's been addressed in the report, the calculations, and I don't want to speak for Mr. Belay, but I believe that Tetra Tech is in agreement with that.
All right, well, we're going to ask Mr. Belay to speak for himself right now. So, do you agree with that characterization? And if not, why not?
I do agree with Mr. Leidner's characterization of the stormwater.
Okay, great. And Ms. Beardsley, having heard that, do you think it's responsive?
Yes.
Excellent.
So I'm pleased to hear that. And I assume that also means that the not greater than plus or minus 10% change in run-on runoff has that been addressed or considered?
Good Leidner.
May I?
Please.
We haven't looked specifically at the percentages. I can tell you there's no increase in the runoff.
Okay.
So as is typical, and required actually, the peak flow in the proposed does not exceed the existing condition. In terms of, I think you mentioned decrease as well. We'd have to look at that. I know that we are not rerouting any flow fundamentally where it may be going to a particular wetland or place in a wetland today, and we're just cutting it off and sending it somewhere else. That's not the case. So I'm sorry, I can't answer the percentage question off the top of my head, but I can tell you that the flows in the proposed are very much consistent with existing in terms of where they are going to, and they're not exceeding the flow in the existing condition.
Mr. Belay, do you agree?
I agree. There were, I believe there were 6 analysis points for this project, which was, stormwaters being greatly, I guess, interspersed throughout the development. So, we were happy to see that, and it's certainly a good way to deal with it, where you're having smaller areas of impoundment rather than just having one large basin. It certainly helps the site and stormwater flow.
All right. And Ms. Beardsley, do you find that responsive?
Yes, and I do appreciate you sharing that with me. We went through some of the report, but I have to apologize. The Board of Health has had its hair on fire for the last year. So, and then I have one other issue that we may write into you about, and that is about the irrigation well, because that's a standard. I mean, the Board of Health has control over, given by the state, passed down to us because the state does not regulate private wells. The local boards of health do. We do not permit irrigation wells at the moment without a very good reason to have them. usually agriculture. So that would be something that I know that there's a possibility that it might be considered in the future. I don't know where that stands and what other arrangements could be made, but we could discuss all of that at some point if the applicant would like to do that. Unfortunately, we've never had them come to a meeting. They haven't approached us on any topic, so.
Okay, I would imagine their waivers cover that, and therefore you and they ought to speak. I would assume that part of their argument is going to be, since we are using public water here and therefore pulling nothing out of the ground for our drinking water, perhaps we might be allowed a waiver for an irrigation well. But because typically you don't have the problem of no drinking water coming out of the ground. It doesn't happen in our town. Everybody needs it. So.
Right. And there, you know, that I'd be interested to talk about what other options might be to address it. But,
okay.
so I don't know how we proceed with that.
I think in the future, through the chair.
Go ahead, Mr. McDowell.
I think in the future, if we think we may want to have wells, we'll approach the Board of Health on that issue.
Okay, but there isn't one in the project now.
Yes.
Okay.
There is not one yet. We're working with Framingham to figure out how much water we're going to be able to allow.
Okay, so Board of Health, if you feel so strongly in this issue that you think this project ought to be conditioned on never having an irrigation well, you should so state, although I think that might be a tough one for us to sell to Hack. Even if we voted
All right,
for it.
we'll talk about it at our next meeting.
Right.
But I don't know that we were thinking that because I do think there may be workarounds.
Okay. Mr. Boulay.
Yeah, I'd just like to offer maybe a possible solution that you could possibly do, rainwater capture, things like that would, have a cistern on site. If Framingham doesn't allow it through the domestic water and the town's not allowing an irrigation well through the, Board of Health, then, it's certainly an option for rainwater capture cistern and pull out of that for irrigation.
Got it. Ms. Beardsley.
That's exactly one of the things I would have wanted to talk about. So glad you mentioned that.
Good to see that fine minds are all moving in the same direction. Okay. Other issues that people wish to speak to tonight? Matt, were you trying to say something, or was it you probably just shuffled the paper and your microphone picked it up?
I'm sorry. No, I have nothing more to add. Thank you.
Board members, would you entertain a motion to adjourn for the evening, given that we'll speak again on the 14th?
Can I ask about
Mr. Lesser, one quickly.
It's shown to be beyond the scope here, but I've brought it up before, wearing a different hat of the sort of the Energy Committee hat of whether the developers would comment on whether they have been able to pursue any other studies such as they had talked about with other consultants about making the buildings more sustainable or just lowering their energy use for the long term, since they do have a heavy footprint in town for decades, and whether there's been any possibilities of going beyond the minimum of the current code.
Mr. McDowell.
And combine that with the issue of water conservation issues, of whether that's a condition.
And I'm not sure, it's the younger Mr. McDowell, I think, who wants to be heard.
Actually, Todd, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So I think we have been speaking with Michael for quite a while about this. We have been looking at all kinds of things, whether it be solar panels, whether it be forms of construction. I know at one point Michael had mentioned passive house. We're looking at that. I doubt we're going to be able to get there from a cost point of view. And to be frank with you, depending on how things go through the process with the ZBA and the Concom, and what things may end up happening that become expensive to us, is going to have a direct bearing on what we can do from the other side, because it's a zero-sum game in terms of what you can afford to do to make a project financially viable. So we really need to get through the process before we understand that fully.
All right, and the other, I won't say older or younger, I'll say the other Mr. McDowell.
And I just want to add one point to that is, as we mentioned in our last meeting with the interbasin transfer, that does kick us over to MIPA. And that is one of the steps that we'll be taking as we go through the MIPA process as well.
Oh, does that apply? That's for the water conservation in particular?
You know what? I'm not 100% sure on that.
I mean, is that something that could be a condition for the ZBA to try to push for?
I have to say that in a town like Sherborn, with our percentage of affordable housing, going to hack with saying we've conditioned this project on doing various energy conservation methods is not going to end well. That's probably the gentlest way I can say it. We'd be pureed.
I agree.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, those are just
No,
the
you've
rules
said it
we're stuck
before.
with. It. I don't like the statute at all. I've said that before, but we all took an oath to administer it, and we're trying to do that.
Understood.
All right. Darrell Beardsley.
Board of Health hat on. Regarding the question earlier about if someone outside of this project got connected to the Framingham water supply, would they also have to connect to sewer? And the answer to that would be no. In a way, it would be a benefit to us to be essentially importing water into our very limited watershed. So.
Right. No, agreed.
And it would be better statewide to not be then shipping it out and disposing of it much farther away from the source.
Correct. But we all hope that never happens and that the wells on Meadowbrook
Right.
work fine.
That's for sure.
All right. I think there was a motion on the table to adjourn. I don't think we got to a second.
I second.
Okay. Lively debate. Objections from the crowd. Dennis, are you trying to get my attention, or are you trying to turn off your screen? Trying to turn off your screen. Got it. Okay. It's hard to tell in these things. I'm sorry, folks. I'm doing the best I can. All right. In that case, we're adjourned until April 14th at 7 p.m. As always, thanks everybody for your time and your thoughtfulness. All in favor of adjourning, we have to roll call. Novak votes aye.
Epic aye.
Fitch, aye.
All right. Everybody have a safe evening.
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.